Hello and welcome. If everyone could start to find your seats, we are about to kick off. Before we get into the real reason we're all here, this amazing panel featuring these incredible experts, I just wanted to kick things off to welcome you all. My name is Talia Reynolds. I manage membership and events for World Denver, an amazing local nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting global engagement and international exchange throughout Denver. We host amazing speaker events in partnership with our community partners as well as on our own, bringing in experts who speak on issues related to foreign affairs. We connect the Denver community with incredible rising leaders from around the world through programs that the State Department implements and various other partners to really just enrich that citizen diplomacy that is truly thriving here in Denver. We also have an amazing international education program called the World Affairs Challenge, which actually originated here at DU 30 years ago, and then we adopted it. So before I hand things over, I just want to, again, thank you all for being here, taking time out of a Thursday evening to come and listen. And I would also like to invite you all to check out our World Denver table over there. We have a couple events coming up, including our next speaker event featuring Steve Clemens, who's the founding editor at large of Semaphore. He's going to be speaking on what foreign policy is going to look like in the context of the 2024 election. So very light and easy breezy stuff. We are also thrilled to be hosting another partner event with DU, specifically the career event for any young professionals in the audience who are interested in exploring global opportunities to enrich your career, whether you're looking into researching, studying, or working abroad. It's going to be an amazing career networking event that we're going to be hosting over at the Burwell Center. So thank you all again for the third time, and without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Epstein to kick us off. Thank you.
Oh, greetings, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Rachel Epstein. I'm on faculty at the Korbel School, and I also serve as Senior Associate Dean here. Our panel this evening includes many esteemed scholars and addresses the urgent issue of nuclear weapons. Russian threats of nuclear use in the war in Ukraine has brought this deadly technology back to the forefront of international security. But of course, as our panelists will tell you tonight, the threats never went away. Russian threats are just a reminder that we need to pay sustained attention, not only to possible use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, but also to the dangers of nuclear proliferation, expanding arsenals, and the risk of accidental detonation, among other problems. Tonight's event is, as you just heard, in collaboration between the Sié Center for International Security and Diplomacy here at the Joseph Korbel School and World Denver. I just want to say a word about the Sié Center, which sponsors research and programming on many critical themes, including international security, women's leadership, social movements, and responsible policy engagement by scholars. So let me tell you a little bit about the panel. Would you all like to come take a seat on the stage? I'll tell you a little bit about their bios. So I think first I will introduce Matthew Fuhrmann, who's just taking a seat now. Matthew is a professor of political science at Texas A&M University, but he is currently a visiting professor at Yale for this academic year. His work focuses on nuclear weapons, diplomacy and bargaining, and alliance politics. His most recent book, which I believe is out this year, is called Influence Without Arms: The New Logic of Nuclear Deterrence. Second, we have Professor Scott Sagan, who is the Caroline S.G. Monroe Professor of Political Science at Stanford University, where he also co-directs the Center for International Security and Cooperation. Professor Sagan has authored and edited multiple books on nuclear strategy, nuclear safety, and nuclear proliferation throughout his career, including most recently, The Fragile Balance of Terror with Vipin Narang. Thirdly, we have the panelist on my far left is our own Debak Das, who is the mastermind behind this event tonight. Thank you so much, Debak, for organizing it. And he's an assistant professor at the Joseph Korbel School. His current book project is called Delivering the Bomb: The Spread of Nuclear Delivery Systems and the Global Non-Proliferation Order. Professor Das, in my experience of him, knows a lot about everything, but he has particular experience and expertise in South Asia and the Indo-Pacific, and has prior work experience organizing Track 2 dialogues between India and Pakistan on nuclear as well as other security issues. And finally, moderating our panel, let me welcome Professor Marie Berry, also of the Korbel School. She's also the director of the Sié Center for International Security and Diplomacy, which is hosting this event tonight along with World Denver. Professor Berry researches many issues, among them the impact of mass violence on women's political mobilization. She's the author of the award-winning book, War, Women, and Power: From Violence to Mobilization in Rwanda and Bosnia-Herzegovina. I cannot imagine a better qualified group of people than those on this panel to deepen our understanding about the nuclear issues before us. We are so grateful for your presence and expertise. Professor Berry will begin by posing some questions to our panelists, and then later in the program, you'll be able to ask your own questions of the panel, and I hope that you will take advantage. So let's begin. Thanks, Marie. You need this?
Thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you again to World Denver. We're always delighted to be able to collaborate with you all. It allows us to bring a really wonderful group of people into the same room. So I want to begin tonight by asking all of you about the moment that we are in right now, today, in 2024. We are well into our second year of the war between Russia and Ukraine. Israel's ongoing war in Gaza has threatened to spill over into a broader regional conflict with Iran. In the Indo-Pacific, tensions between Taiwan and China, the Korean Peninsula, between India, Pakistan, and China, and elsewhere remain deeply challenging. So how should we be thinking about nuclear threats today? What are the stakes? And I'd like to invite you to perhaps start us off, Scott.
Well, I'm worried about many potential flashpoints right now. I think the war in Ukraine is the most serious one. When the war began, the picture that was all over the papers was of Vladimir Putin at one end of the table and the defense minister and chief of the general staff at the other end. And,
A little closer.
and that was a photograph that went viral, but it also symbolized the danger of having a personalist dictator making decisions, often on his own, based on delusions, on whims. And he threatened to use nuclear weapons when he announced the war in Ukraine. Nothing much happened. They didn't go on a higher state of alert, and the CIA, we now know, said the probability is very low. That changed entirely within the year. We now know that the CIA thought there was a 50-50 chance of nuclear weapons being used in October 2022, because Putin at that point was losing. And he said that there was a precedent for using nuclear weapons to end a war, citing the dropping of the bomb in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. I would just note that the United States had a major effort to try to dissuade the Russians from using nuclear weapons. Secretary of State Blinken, Secretary of Defense Austin, head of the CIA Bill Burns, all spoke with their counterparts, in some cases more than once, and warned of catastrophic consequences. We don't know the details, but it's been reported that it included statements around the issue that we thus far have been constrained only aiding Ukraine. We will not be constrained. And you're right, there was a precedent set in 1945, but Japan couldn't strike us back. We can strike you back. And it was a threat of conventional attacks on Russian forces in Ukraine, the Black Sea, and potentially elsewhere. The Russians didn't use nuclear weapons, but this crisis isn't over. Because if Russia begins to lose again, the same situation could emerge. And we need to be prepared for a potential crisis with Ukraine. I think we can talk about other crises elsewhere in the world, but to me, that's the one that we're still in the middle of. There's a pause because the Russians are doing well, but I personally want Ukraine to win this war, but I know that there's going to be a risk involved if they do so.
Thank you, Scott. I think that's very sobering to start us off. Matt, I'm curious about your thoughts about what we really should be paying attention to right now.
I share Scott's concerns about what's going on in Ukraine. Maybe I'll comment more generally about the non-proliferation landscape in the world right now. One of the remarkable facets of nuclear proliferation is that we're 70 plus years into the nuclear age, and only 10 countries have ever built nuclear weapons. That's remarkable, especially when you think about the way that other military technologies have diffused. Think, for example, about armed drones. In the 1990s, we had just 2 countries that fielded armed drones, Israel and the United States. Now there's more than 30, and that number's growing daily and monthly. But with nuclear weapons, that hasn't been the case. There are a lot of reasons for that, which we can get into later. But for now, I just want to point out that I'm worried that the proverbial floodgates could be opening up because of what's going on in Ukraine, because of what's going on in North Korea, and because of what's going on in Iran. So when you look out at the world today, you see many countries that are starting to rethink their nuclear futures. You have officials in South Korea that are getting increasingly jittery about what North Korea is up to. Meanwhile, they're concerned about whether they can trust the United States to provide for their security. During the Cold War, French leader Charles de Gaulle famously questioned whether Washington would sacrifice New York in order to save Paris. And this motivated France to go all the way and develop its own indigenous nuclear weapons. There's a concern that a future South Korean leader, be it President Yoon or somebody else, might think something similarly. Meanwhile, back in 2015, when the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was concluded with Iran, in my view, the probability of Iran getting nuclear weapons was very small. Now, subsequent to the US withdrawal from that agreement, I think the probability of Iran getting nuclear weapons in the next 3 to 5 years is quite high. We know for sure that their breakout time, the time it would take to have enough fissile material to make a bomb, which was 1 year under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, is now very small, a matter of a single-digit number of days. And so that's an increasingly dangerous situation as well. So broadly, there's a lot of countries that we need to have an eye on and worry about their potential proliferation in the future.
Thank you, Matt. I think it's a remarkable reminder when you note that there are only 10 countries that have ever developed nuclear weapons, and of course, one gave that process up, South Africa, correct? So I'm curious, Debak, where are you focusing right now, and where do you see the kind of most grave threats to the world order coming from right now?
Thanks a lot, Marie. I think there's no debate about the main worry being the potential nuclear exchange over the Ukraine war. So I think that's foremost. What I'd like to turn our attention to a little bit is beyond that, what are some of the major worries, right? And the area that I'm thinking about most right now is something that Matt alluded to, which is the Indo-Pacific. You've got a number of different vectors of worry, if you will, in that region. And one, of course, is the issue of North Korea's building up of missile systems and missile delivery systems. South Korea just developed and has been testing these submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Those are worries that, these are signs that South Korea might potentially nuclearize at some point. Public opinion in South Korea for a nuclear bomb is pretty high. The other issue is that you've got a broad set of countries now trying to develop short-range and intermediate-range ballistic missile capabilities. And that includes countries like Japan, of course, South Korea, Taiwan is acquiring these weapon systems, Australia is acquiring cruise missiles as a part of the broader AUKUS framework. So I think that with a larger number of delivery weapons as well as high-tech conventional weapons, the potential for flashpoints in some of these among some of these states in this region is high. The other issue is, I think there's a domino effect with regard to proliferation that we also need to be thinking about. And that is, the United States, of course, is modernizing its nuclear arsenal, and you've got missile defenses along with that being built up. Now, China is responding to that. To the best of our knowledge, China is also modernizing its nuclear arsenal. It's building new nuclear silos, and there's been a qualitative and quantitative increase in their nuclear forces. Now, while China is responding to the United States, India is responding to China. So India is looking at some of these advances that the Chinese forces are making in terms of especially their rocket forces. And India now has a new conventional rocket force, which is called the Integrated Rocket Force. And it's also just developed MIRV capacity, which is that you can put multiple warheads onto a single missile. So that's India responding to China. And of course, you've got Pakistan responding to India's nuclear and missile capability developments, right? So Pakistan is trying to keep up with India. India is trying to keep up with China. China is trying to keep up with the US. So those are things that I think we should be worried about in terms of a longer trend towards greater proliferation of nuclear and missile systems.
I think that's really helpful context, and it helps kind of frame that, as you said, that sort of domino effect or the escalation that could happen here, which of course seems very worrisome, particularly since over the last 25 years, only one state has gained, that I'm aware of, has gained nuclear weapons capability, right, with North Korea. So in some ways, we have a very strong norm and a strong non-proliferation order, and that seems to be challenged in some ways right now. I want to give you all another chance to tell me kind of if there's, Scott in particular, you kind of grounded your comments in Russia and Ukraine. Do you share some of the same concerns that came up as well, or are there other cases you're looking at?
I do share those concerns. I want to try to link them. Both Matt and Debak commented on potential proliferation, that is, that one threat can encourage another. Back to the Ukraine war, the possibility here is that Russia might decide to use nuclear weapons in a limited way to try to end the war. Will that produce more nuclear states to say, oh, now there's not a taboo against nuclear weapons, we need to get them too? And I have a clear and simple answer to that. It depends. It depends on whether that nuclear use is successful or whether it's a failure. If Putin used nuclear weapons and the United States said, we're ending all aid, we're not going to get involved, or if the Zelensky government collapsed and the Russians were able to take over the rest of Ukraine, I think a lot of countries would say, oh, we need nuclear weapons too. If, on the other hand, what I suggested we were threatening was actually enacted and US and NATO forces destroyed lots of Russian forces, and the Russians then sued for peace, others would say nuclear weapons didn't get Russia a whole lot. That's a dangerous situation to be in. And that's why, to me, focusing on this question is there are other nuclear problems as well that we can talk about. But to me, what happens with this major war between two states in Europe with a nuclear shadow hanging over it is something that's going to determine the future of non-proliferation, not just the future of Ukraine.
So this leads to the question, right, Scott, that, you know, even though there's a lot of worry around states that have been kind of escalating, and there's this very, very grave situation in Russia and Ukraine right now, we still haven't seen the use of a nuclear bomb deployed since Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. So where are we looking to in all of these cases to stem that tide? Where do we see promising efforts or initiatives or arrangements to actually to prevent us from approaching that terrifying scenario of the use of these weapons?
Do one of you two have an optimistic thing to add now?
Nobody's looking for optimism. You all came to a nuclear weapon. No.
I can say something optimistic, which is that we have an international treaty called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which entered into force in 1970. And this treaty says that if you're one of 5 countries that got nuclear weapons before 1967, you can continue to possess those weapons. The US is included in that group. And then the treaty says everyone else has to pledge not to ever acquire nuclear weapons. And they have to accept international inspections to verify that they're complying with that commitment. When I was in graduate school early on in my career, I was somewhat of a skeptic about the effectiveness of this treaty. But my views have changed a lot over time as I've done more research, done more analysis, seen more historical evidence. Now I'm convinced that it's one of the most successful treaties ever created in terms of the degree to which it constrained and deterred countries that might have otherwise gone on to build nuclear weapons from doing so. There are many countries in Europe, for example, that before the treaty entered into force were thinking with different levels of intensity about possibly getting nuclear weapons, and in many other regions of the world as well. And there's good reasons to think that the treaty helped restrain to some degree the number of countries that have obtained nuclear weapons. So I mentioned earlier only 10 countries have done it. I think the Non-Proliferation Treaty is a major reason why that's the case. Not the only reason, but a very key reason. This treaty is still ongoing, and I think it gives us some cause for optimism that we can rein in the international spread of nuclear weapons to some degree. Now, to be sure, the treaty has come under strain from multiple fronts. In the past, countries like Iraq and Iran and others have violated their commitments under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, so it's by no means a perfect international agreement, but there is no such thing as a perfect international agreement. So, although the international non-proliferation architecture, again, is under severe strain right now, I think the history of post-1970 should give us some comfort that policies pursued by the international community, including the United States, and especially the United States today, can help dissuade the further spread of nuclear weapons.
Matt, could you tell us whether the Non-Proliferation Treaty stands alone in that space of stemming the tide of proliferation, or are we looking at a broader suite of institutional arrangements and treaties that are also designed to prevent this proliferation problem?
Yeah, so we have a broader set of institutions that we commonly refer to as the non-proliferation regime. And it's often said that the Non-Proliferation Treaty is the anchor of this regime. But there are other institutions and treaties that are part of this, including things like regional nuclear weapons-free zones, which prohibit the stationing, deployment, and development of nuclear weapons in particular regions. It would also include various other arrangements designed to, for example, restrict the export of sensitive nuclear materials and other commodities. And so it's not just one treaty, it's a broader architecture of arrangements that collectively work towards that common goal.
Yeah, so I'd just add to that that there's also, and this is not to be too hopeful, but to add that there are multiple movements, right? Of course, there's a non-proliferation regime, and there's also in recent years the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which a number of countries, more than 100 countries, have signed. Not all of them have necessarily ratified it, but more than 90 have definitely ratified it. So this movement has a set of non-nuclear states, some states which have felt the harms of nuclear testing in the South Pacific. So they've sort of come together to create this almost norm of banning nuclear weapons, saying that just the possession of nuclear weapons is immoral, and given the kind of harms that they could cause, the potential use of nuclear weapons could cause, they should just be banned. Now, this has oftentimes been at loggerheads with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I don't think that it necessarily has to be at loggerheads with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And time will tell whether those two regimes can coexist and be mutually beneficial to each other. But which is to say that even if we do have potential nuclear use and other states might look at that and say, hey, should we now get nuclear weapons? There are more than 100 countries which have signed on to another treaty which bans nuclear weapons, and they're creating a norm around the non-possession of nuclear weapons. Those, in my view at least, are positive trend lines. Now, are there fault lines between different regime structures? Yes. And those are things that we can talk about and figure out as we go along, I think.
I think this makes me want to ask Scott, going back to Ukraine and Russia, what are the implications of Putin's threats to the non-proliferation regime and to the current status of these efforts to begin to, again, curb the
There's
tide?
an irony here. Debak was right that there are tensions between those states that have signed and ratified the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which makes nuclear weapons possession illegal. It is illegal only if you've signed and ratified it. It's not illegal if you haven't signed and ratified it. No nuclear state, obviously, nuclear weapon state, and no allies who have security guarantees from any of those, from any nuclear weapon state, have signed the treaty. And ironically, all 5 NPT-permitted nuclear weapon states have gone together and made a statement collectively saying that they will never ratify this treaty, and this treaty does not represent international law. It cannot become something that anybody who has not signed it or ratified it has to follow. So it's brought together this group. Now, the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, nuclear weapon states that are permitted and the non-nuclear weapon states that have to agree not to seek to acquire nuclear weapons get together every 5 years and say, how are we doing? And they'll come up with a set of potential, they can't really be amendments because you can't amend that kind of treaty without having to get it all ratified again. But instead they come up with some politically binding deals and say, well, if the nuclear states do this, the non-nuclear states will do this, and we'll get a better treaty regime. The last time that really worked was in 1995, when in exchange for the non-nuclear weapon states voting to make this treaty in place in perpetuity, the nuclear states, including the United States, said, we will ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty to say that we will never test nuclear weapons again. And that's sort of how the NPT evolves over time. What happened when the United States said that we would ratify? The Clinton administration took it to the Senate, asked then Senator Joe Biden to lead it, and it failed. So the United States has not ratified. We haven't kept through our political commitment that made the other states agree to have this in perpetuity. So it's interesting that, that these treaties and the questions about actions in conflicts interact, because these treaties are interpreted by different states, and they sign and agree to them as long as they're in their interests. And they don't always, they're not always able to make the changes that they want to make. So I worry, I agree with these positive notions, but I do worry that in the future, under the NPT, if you give a 6 months notice that this no longer is in your interest, you can withdraw. Only one state has ever done that, North Korea. But if some of these problems emerge, the treaty is a constraint, but it's not, it does not end their ability. And that would be true of the Prohibition Treaty as well. A state could withdraw from it if it decides to do so.
Well, it sounds like there's this perennial tension between international law, which has to be kind of held together with norms, right? And the norms that continue to enforce it. And I'm just curious, in this conversation and based on everything that Scott just said, Matt, how, you see Russia pulling out of the New START treaty. You see these, the ability of states to kind of move in and out of these treaties when it serves their interests. And so what are you looking at right now, or where do you think we should be paying attention to the kind of current political dynamic as it shapes the non-proliferation efforts and the regime writ large?
It's a really important question. I think there's some optimism on the multilateral front in terms of the non-proliferation treaty, like I talked about. But when it comes to bilateral arms control, I'm not so optimistic right now. Russia has suspended its participation in or withdrawn from the remaining key arms control agreements that it had concluded with the United States. The United States would ideally like to conclude an arms control deal that would include both Russia and China, that would put some sort of restrictions on the number of nuclear forces these countries could obtain. China does not seem enthusiastic about this idea, from what I've seen so far, and neither does Russia. So in terms of what might happen between the major powers in the arms control space, I think there's cause for pessimism right now at the moment. But we still have these broader multilateral initiatives that I think are doing a lot of good in terms of constraining the spread of nuclear weapons. And if I can just add one thing about Ukraine, there's a lot of learning that takes place in international politics, just like in everyday life. Scott made an important point earlier about what if Putin uses a nuclear weapon in Ukraine? What effect will that have on how other countries respond? That is undoubtedly something we should worry about. To some extent, there's been some damage done already. And to understand why, we just need to back up to the end of the Cold War for a moment, when the Soviet Union collapsed. And at that time, it had nuclear missiles spread throughout the former Soviet republics, including in Ukraine. So when Ukraine became an independent country, it had former Soviet, now Russian, nuclear weapons on its territory. And there were there was an agreement concluded that involved Russia and the United States to get Ukraine to return those weapons back to Moscow. Now, to be clear, Ukraine never had operational control over those weapons. These were not Ukrainian weapons that they could have used. These were Russian nuclear weapons. But there was a perception in the international community, among many, that Ukraine was more or less a nuclear power because it had inherited these forces. So the deal that was signed in 1994, called the Budapest Agreement, obligated Ukraine to return these weapons, and in exchange, wait for it, Russia said, "Don't worry, we won't invade you." Well, when that happened years later, this cultivated a perception in the international community that if you don't have nuclear weapons, you're vulnerable to invasion. And the other side of that coin is, if Ukraine had kept they weren't its nuclear weapons, but if Ukraine was a nuclear power that had nuclear weapons, would Russia have invaded it? And, there's good reasons to question whether it would have. So, there's a lot of unanswered questions here. There's a lot that's unknowable. But one lesson that some countries have drawn from this conflict is that if you are really interested in invasion insurance, you might want to invest in nuclear weapons. So if you're Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, countries that Russia might be interested in also invading at some point in the future, you might...
You have Polish politicians and German politicians talking about nuclear weapons possession for the first time.
Exactly, yeah. So a lot of damage, I think, has already been done from a non-proliferation standpoint. So, now the challenge is coming in and trying to dispel some of these notions that you need nuclear weapons as invasion insurance. So there's a lot of diplomacy that is going to need to happen to reverse this perception.
And it strikes me when you're saying this that, I can only imagine this is one of the big, issues with North Korea, right? Without diplomatic channels and things like this, the holding of nuclear weapons seems very rational to prevent that invasion. And I'd love to learn more about that if anyone would like to comment. But I'll turn to Debak next to give us a little bit more context. You talked about the relationship between China and India and Pakistan, and I'm curious if you can tell us a bit more about non-proliferation efforts in the Indo-Pacific specifically, as well as ongoing risks of proliferation today.
Right. Thank you. It's a region that I think about a lot, and going to track twos as well. I'm channeling some of that pessimism from the previous comment.
It's contagious. This is
It
really
is,
worrisome.
isn't it? But I think, you've got 3 countries that are nuclear powers. And in fact, if you think of the broader map of Asia, you've got a number of countries that are now contiguous with nuclear weapons, right? Like Russia shares a border with China, North Korea shares a border with China, India shares a border with China, Pakistan shares a border with China and India. So really, these are... this is an area that I would be extremely worried about. But in terms of non-proliferation, I think that ship essentially has sailed in the region, right? Are smaller countries like, say, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Nepal likelier to get nuclear weapons? I don't think so. That said, the question is, to what extent are we worried today that there might be potential nuclear use? Between India and Pakistan over the last couple of years, there's been a sort of stabilization of relations. Pakistan is worried about its economy a lot more. It's the LOC, which is the line of control in Kashmir, where the 2 countries meet, has, after 2019, not really seen any major escalation. For India, the worry has become less Pakistan and more China. And this you see from 2020 onwards specifically. So in 2020, the Chinese army, the PLA, crossed into what was understood to be Indian territory along the line of actual control, which is a border, but not really an international border. It's a boundary line where both sides decided, this side is Indian, this side is Chinese, before you can have a proper treaty that agrees that this is an international boundary. The Chinese army came in. There were about 10,000 troops that came in. India lost a significant part of its territory. The 2 armies clashed, not with guns, because there is a certain protocol where you don't carry guns in certain sectors, and so they clashed with almost medieval weapons, right? You had barbed wire around sticks, stones, that kind of thing. And there was, after a couple of months, a sort of drawing down of that. a sort of new boundary was drawn up. So India's lost a certain amount of territory there. And as the last couple of years have passed, you've had different flashpoints like this all along the line of actual control between India and China. So India is now looking at its military forces and thinking, well, point one, we are conventionally far behind China. And we are not unable to use rocket and missile forces against China because India's ballistic missiles are all in its Strategic Forces Command, which is a nuclear command, right? So now what they've done in the last couple of years is that they have now set up a new rocket force division, which is going to be entirely conventional. So the idea is China has committed that they will never use nuclear weapons first, right? So they have a no first use. India has also committed that it has a no first use policy, that it will not use nuclear weapons first against an adversary. Now, under that threshold, though, could you have conventional escalation where you might be able to use things like rocket forces against each other and potentially escalate if another side comes into your territory? I think the likelihood of that has increased considerably in the last couple of years. So now you might say, well, that's stability at the nuclear level. They can fight it out at the conventional level. But then the question is, who's going to be able to control that ladder of escalation from conventional, high-stakes conventional to up to nuclear, right? So those are things that I'm concerned about when it comes to South Asia and Southern Asia writ large.
I want to follow up on the opportunity to say something about North Korea, because I think this is a mixed case. I was deeply worried in 2017 and 2018 when the United States was threatening to attack North Korea. Remember, President Trump said that if you continue making threats to us, you will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. And that wasn't a threat of retaliation. That was a threat of the United States starting a war, of preventive war to stop North Korea from developing ICBM capability against the United States, coupled with their nuclear capability. We often talk as if deterrence works all the time and everyone will be level-headed because we fear the consequences of nuclear war. But go back to that 2017, 2018 crisis. I think many of you will remember an incident that occurred in January 2018 where a emergency system operator in Hawaii put out an alert telling people that the North Korean missiles are incoming to Hawaii. This is not a test. This is not a test. Some people in Hawaii panicked, went outside to see what they should do. If they could see it, they should go into a shelter or get into the basement or get in the middle of your house to avoid fallout if it's coming. But nobody in Omaha, where the Strategic Command is, or in Washington in the Pentagon, or at NORAD, down in Colorado Springs, panicked at Cheyenne Mountain. And the reason why we're I guess, threefold. One is that we have redundant warning systems, and none of them said the missile's incoming. Second, the people corrected themselves. They said, oh, yeah, we made a mistake, and within, I think, 16 minutes or so, people started broadcasting, no, this was a mistake. We had professional people who were willing to admit fault. And three, we really didn't think that North Korea was about to attack us, right? Now imagine that that incident occurred in North Korea. All three of the mitigating factors wouldn't be present. One, they don't have redundant systems. They have pretty lousy old radars. And if they gave a false warning, there wouldn't be backup systems telling them it's wrong. Second, in the United States, you can get in trouble for making a mistake like that. In North Korea, you can get killed. So the likelihood that they would say, oh, wow, we made a mistake is less, and it's more likely that they would just leave. They'd try to get out of there. And lastly, the belief that, oh, they're not going to start a war didn't exist at the time because we were threatening to start a war against them. So the good news here, and it's odd for me to be optimistic on these issues, is A, we're not threatening North Korea the way we were under the Trump administration. And B, some of the North Korean better technology that they're getting for warning is actually a good thing. I wish they were not developing some of their better missile technology, but some of their warning technology in a nuclear world is actually something that can reduce risk rather than increase risk.
Thank you. Matt, please jump in.
I just wanted to follow up and ask Scott a question, which is then, can you say something about the policy question of whether paradoxically it's a good idea for the United States to assist potential adversaries with their nuclear arsenals so that they're safer and more secure?
Yeah, it's a very tricky question. The NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, makes the nuclear weapon states promise that they will not help other states acquire nuclear weapons. In fact, on 9/11, when the attacks occurred in New York and at the Pentagon, I was in Washington, D.C. for a meeting that I was supposed to speak at the National Security Council of the United States, because we were trying to explore what could we do to help India and Pakistan with nuclear safety and security. That meeting wasn't held on 9/11 because people were busy with other things, obviously. But the State Department lawyers who had said we can't help them with nuclear safety and security got overruled after 9/11 by saying, of course we're going to help India and Pakistan with security and safety, not with weapons design, not with acquiring weapons, but with best practices, what's gone right and what's gone wrong, with our ability to protect our weapons. We have something called the Nuclear Emergency Search Team System that sends out people from the laboratories who are trained how to dismantle a weapon. We started talking to them about how we did that. And the ruling was that the treaty permits that. So I would certainly be willing to talk to the North Koreans about how to protect their weapons in a better way. I wouldn't help them get more weapons. I wouldn't help them get better ICBMs. But on safety and security, I think we have to accept that some countries, once they get nuclear weapons, it's in our interest to make sure that they're held more safely and more securely.
Can I have a quick follow-up on that? Again, on North Korea, the United States has had this expectation that there might be some form of denuclearization at some point. Would helping them with the safety and security of these systems essentially say, well, no, now we recognize you as a state with nuclear weapons and hence are going to be willing to help? Does that mean that denuclearization then is, of course, completely off the table and you treat North Korea as you would, say, India, Pakistan, or Israel as a de facto nuclear weapons power?
I think that would be the effect of doing that. We have gone down that path before of saying we will sanction you, we will do all sorts of things. And over time, we changed our policy towards India and have never acknowledged whether or not Israel has nuclear weapons. But I would differentiate between saying that our goal is still that you will work towards nuclear disarmament and we will aid you in moving in that direction by trying to have fewer threats to North Korea, to have agreements with South Korea, et cetera. I divorce those issues, which I think can continue, from the idea of helping you with the safety and security of the existing arsenal. You can say, we want you to get rid of this, but in the meantime, let's make it more secure.
I mean, at the basic level, just opening up diplomatic channels and relationships that would be necessary to have those conversations
That would
is
help.
extremely important, right? Yeah. I have a million questions I would like to ask you. I hear that what you were talking about, Scott, around close calls. I think many people in the general public don't actually know about those, both the false alarms, like the one you just spoke about with the missiles coming to Hawaii, as well as the real close calls in which the general public may not be aware of how close there's been this coming to the brink, right, multiple times. So that's one question I want to ask. I also would like to ask about technology and how shifting technologies, including some of the ones you mentioned, Debak, and the with China and India's arsenal, how that is also shaping some of these questions. And I'll kind of throw both of those to you because I really do want to shift to audience questions. But let maybe all of you have another chance to just talk about if either of those general themes sound like something you'd like to chime in on.
Well, I'll mention what I think was one of the greatest close calls to nuclear weapons use that could have escalated very, very quickly. In 2002, I had the privilege of going to Cuba with Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense for the Kennedy administration, and to meet with Fidel Castro and the leaders of Cuba to open up some of the archives on both sides and have both leaders meet for the first time. We had known a lot about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but something was first exposed there, which we had not known. The United States, you will recall, was planning, if the missiles weren't pulled out, to have an invasion of Cuba, to have a major airstrike. And then we were preparing for an invasion to make sure that any weapons that were there would no longer be there. And we assumed that we had captured the warheads because we saw some of the missiles on the boats that were on the way to Cuba and saw them and hoped that they would turn around, right? What we were told at that meeting in 2002 for the first time was that the Russians already had a number of tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba for the short-range missiles, which would have been used to attack the American ships in the D-Day-like invasion that we were going to have. Robert McNamara just turned ashen. He did not want to have the invasion. He was the one in favor of the blockade. But remember, the majority of the Kennedy administration's advisors in the Executive Committee of the National Security Council voted for the airstrike and invasion, not the blockade. We did all that not knowing that there were tactical nuclear weapons already there and that the plan was to attack our invasion forces in large scale. So when you're involved with nuclear weapons, we would like to think that deterrence always works. But you don't know everything. So for me, relying on deterrence forever for our security is unwise. It's like skating on thin ice. The fact that you've done it successfully doesn't mean you can do it often or do it forever.
Well, for those of you interested in more detail, Scott has written the definitive book about close calls involving nuclear weapons. I encourage you to check out The Limits of Safety, as well as, what's the book with Waltz called? What's the official title?
Spread of Nuclear Weapons, a Debate.
The Spread of Nuclear Weapons, a Debate, where Scott has an exchange with Kenneth Waltz, another political scientist, about the optimistic or pessimistic effects of nuclear proliferation. One thing I'd add, thinking about close calls, would be going back to the 1980s and thinking about some near misses with the U.S. and the Soviet Union. A lot of the examples we have of close calls involve radar mistaking incoming nuclear missiles for something else. There was an incident in 1983 where a Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov was sitting monitoring Soviet radar systems, and he saw what looked like incoming American nuclear missiles, and an alarm starts sounding. According to Soviet operating procedure at the time, he was meant to take that immediately up the chain of command. But he actually went against standard operating procedure and did not escalate this. When asked why later, he said, well, I just had a funny feeling in my gut. What it actually was the sun reflecting off the clouds. And that's what showed up on the radar system. So imagine that you're in as Scott was saying, a really heated crisis where you're worried about a potential surprise attack, and you get a false alarm like that. It doesn't take too much imagination to think that that could trigger you to fire your own nuclear weapons, fearing that you're about to be attacked yourself. So what worries me is not so much that a leader will be sitting at their desk and make a rational, deliberate decision to say, okay, now I'm going to order a nuclear attack. That could happen, but a more likely scenario, I think, is some kind of accident or miscalculation stemming from a false alarm that triggers unintentional or unintended nuclear use. So history gives us a lot of cause for concern as far as that goes.
Right, and coming from the 80s to 2 years ago, 2022, March, India and Pakistan. India accidentally launched a cruise missile that flew for 6 minutes and then landed inside Pakistan. It wasn't a false alarm. The missile literally, physically went into Pakistan and went and landed near an Air Force base. 3 people from the Indian Air Force were subsequently fired. The Indian Defense Minister said this was a potential for major escalation into war even. Pakistan was extremely responsible. They realized in that short period of time that something had gone wrong, but they did not know whether there was a warhead on that weapon. Now, luckily, the BrahMos missile, which was fired, did not have a warhead in it. But it could just as easily have had a warhead in it. So this is, while we talk about close calls during the Cold War, which are obviously scary and give us a lot of cause for concern, this is happening right now. So as we build more missile systems, as we have an increased modernization capacities of, within the folds of a broader strategy of nuclear deterrence, we've also got to think about these things that are happening right now. On the question of technology, just hearing Scott and Matt talk about some of those examples, I think we are now in an age of deep fakes. We are now in an age of cyber attacks, which are increasingly becoming more and more sophisticated. So when we talk about warning systems and redundancy within warning systems, to what extent would those be redundant to sophisticated cyber attacks or deep fakes, right? Could you trick another country into thinking that they were being attacked with nuclear weapons? I'm not sure. Maybe not today. Maybe in a couple of years. But that capacity may not necessarily be far away. And so I would definitely be concerned about that.
That is deeply worrisome on so many levels, but also strikes me that all of the examples you just gave involve major powers with sophisticated technology and protocols in place, and yet human beings are in those are always human beings operating with all of the safety protocols and checks that must exist. There's always that human factor, and so I think that's very worrisome and a very strong, in some ways, call for the real work to rein in the kind of the use of these technologies. I'd love to open it up to all of you. And so I know there's going to be a lot of questions. Let's do this. We're short on a mic, so I think what I'll ask you to do is speak up and I'll speak the question back, and we'll take a couple questions at once.
We can also share a mic.
We can share.
Yeah.
I don't mind either way. Garrett, start with you. Sorry, no.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for this great panel. It's really, really interesting to listen to. So when I think about the collapse of the non-proliferation regime, I see it in a couple of different areas. Obviously, the NPT has been stagnant for a number of years. Nuclear weapon states have failed to follow through on their Article 6 obligations for disarmament. And kind of like Professor Das was alluding to, nuclear weapon states have a way of utilizing other states' modernizations as a justification for their own modernization. And when you look at, for example, the U.S. outspends China and Russia 3-1 on our nuclear arsenal. The strategic posture review that was released in 2022 cited a need for the U.S. to be able to fight and win a nuclear war against Russia and China simultaneously. And so these are being used as these justifications. I'm wondering what role you see as that the U.S. should be playing in kind of spearheading arms control, especially as the only state that's used nuclear weapons on a civilian population in conflict, and also as the most powerful military force in the world.
I was going to ask if people on the panel know what kinds of negotiations are going on between the United States and Russia to try to deter Russia from using a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. Is there, I mean, obviously it's not public information, but you might know, or you might know based on your historical reading of other events, what do we think is probably going on to try to deter the Russians right now?
Hello, my name is Charles. Firstly, I'd like to say I appreciate the opportunity to ask a question, and I'm thankful to Professor Das for converting me to being a nuclear arms nerd. So that's great. At the beginning of the discussion, Professor Sagan mentioned the risks of Ukrainian victory. In fact, this was supported by Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines, who said at a congressional hearing that as the Russians are pushed back further, the probability of the Russians using nuclear weapons goes up. So my question to Professor Sagan would be, to shut down this dangerous probability, would the most logical conclusion be encouraging the Ukrainians to reach a negotiated settlement with the Russians?
Let's start. I'll say something about two of those questions. One is on this question of U.S., Russia, and China. There are some in Washington who are responding to the buildup on the Chinese forces. The United States modernization program will not create new nuclear weapons. And they're saying, no, we need to create new nuclear weapons, more nuclear weapons to match China and to match Russia. I think that's foolhardy, because if we have as many as Russia and as many as China, we'll have more than either of them individually, and that's a recipe for a three-way arms race. And a three-way arms race can't be won and never should be raced. What we do need to have is more secure. That is, we have to make sure that especially the submarine launched ballistic missiles are not vulnerable. I support a modernization of some of the older ICBMs so that we have some land-based capabilities. So to me, you can have modernization without having buildups, and we don't need to go that way with China. I guess I want to say one thing in response to Dean Epstein's comment is I don't believe the United States and Russia have ongoing talks trying to dissuade the Russians about nuclear use. We did encourage the Indian government and the Chinese government, both of which told the Russians that this would be a really bad idea for them to use nuclear weapons. There are some, but very few, track 2, track 1.5 that is meetings not between government officials, but between scholars and former government officials that discuss this and give warnings. And I would add one extra point to this is the use of a tactical nuclear weapon against a military target would not be illegal. It might be unwise, but it would not be illegal. The use of a nuclear weapon against a city would be illegal. And I believe that we should be reminding the Russian military that this war needs to end, because if you use a nuclear weapon against a Ukrainian city, that will be a war crime, and we will. Do you ever think you're going to leave Russia ever again, or your family will leave Russia ever again? It's going to change the world in a very important way. Will that add to the deterrence? I think just a little bit, but I think every little bit counts in this area.
I'll chime in about the role of the U.S. in leadership and arms control. So I do think the U.S. has an obligation to play a key role here, both because it, along with Russia, has far more nuclear weapons than anyone else currently. Also, I think it's in U.S. strategic interest to minimize the role of nuclear weapons in world politics rather than to maximize that. And part of the reason for that is the United States has overwhelming conventional superiority. So if we're in a world where people are only using conventional weapons, that benefits the United States tremendously right now. So, personally, I think the U.S. needs a reliable second strike capability for sure, but I don't believe the United States needs, a massive nuclear arsenal in order to achieve that end. So it would be nice, in my view, to see, the United States playing a leadership role on the arms control front. As far as, could we get a negotiated settlement to end the war in Ukraine? This is a very tough situation. What I would like to see is for things to go back the way they were, in January of 2022, before this war started. How realistic is that? I'm not sure it's super realistic, unfortunately. There probably needs to be some kind of deal that allows Putin and Russia to save some face, to give them some kind of off-ramp, to allow them to exit things in a graceful way. Because I share the concern. First of all, I did not think Putin was going to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I got that totally wrong. I thought he might, try and slice a little bit of eastern Ukraine away, perhaps. I did not think he was going to go all in. So I have to be very cautious now about what I think he might do in other situations. But my take is that if he is backed into a corner and he believes he's about to suffer, face a humiliating defeat, which he, according to what he says, would view as an existential threat, then he might very well try and resort to use of a tactical nuclear weapon. So, we don't want, that would be terrible, maybe catastrophic for the world. We don't want to see that. So it just makes me wonder whether we should be, again, it's not a popular view to express, and it's not one that I necessarily want to embrace, but I think we should be thinking about what a negotiated settlement could potentially look like in this context.
It's always good if there's a little bit of disagreement on a panel. So I wanted to disagree with one aspect of that, which is wars end not only through negotiated settlements about carving up a deal. One side gets part of what it wants, the other side gets part of what it wants. Wars end sometimes not when leaders change their minds, but when a people or military change who the leader is. And Putin has done a pretty good job of killing off his opposition. So he knows that. That's why he's doing that. That's why he's murdered people from the right and people from the left who have opposed him. But we don't know what he doesn't know. When Khrushchev was overthrown, the Soviet specialist, Zbigniew Brzezinski, later National Security Advisor, was asked, well, how come you didn't predict it? He said, well, Khrushchev didn't predict it either. And so that's one thing that still gives me hope. When Prigozhin started going for Moscow, and then when he gave up, there's a lot of mystery in that. That's a pretty bizarre thing to happen in Russia. So I don't think it's out of the question that this war could end when Vladimir Putin is overthrown internally. Not likely, but certainly possible. Unfortunately, this war could also end when there's a leadership change in the United States. Because at least one candidate in the coming election would end the war by sacrificing Ukraine, would not be giving Ukraine the aid, and would cut it off. And I think Putin is waiting to see what happens in November, because he knows that he might win, depending on what happens in the US election.
I think we can go to other questions. I think most of those questions have been answered pretty well.
Let's take 3 more. I had seen your hand up very quickly. Let's go to John, and then let's go into the back in the middle there. Let's start here.
I'm aware of 3 instances where the acts of a single human being prevented a nuclear war. It may have been your book that I read, I'm not sure. There was the Cuban Missile Crisis, the political officer aboard the Cuban submarine. There was the glinting over the North Pole, where somebody reading that said, no, we're not firing back now. And then the third one, if I recall, was when a glitch in a Russian computer, or some computer, said an attack was coming in, that we were attacking them. I may have that last one wrong. It's hard to see how, my question is, how can the systems be defined and implemented to prevent these kinds of problems which escaped the system's surveillance?
So I'll keep my question short. Simple-ish. I'd like to pivot to the Indo-Pacific, if you don't mind. Recognizing North Korea as a nuclear weapon-capable state, what does that do in terms of setting a precedent for other states like Iran, who are in pursuit, or others who may have had it in the back of their minds in, backroom discussions among the political sphere as to whether or not, take on that challenge once, if North Korea were to be recognized as being a legitimate nuclear weapon state?
Hi, my name is Sarah, and I'm currently a first-year student here at Korbel School. I also have a question related to the Indo-Pacific. So, in 2022, South Korea developed submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and in 2023, the leader of the ruling People Power Party, which is the party of the current President Yoon, stated that South Korea might need to develop nuclear weapons. So with South Korea's advance into arms exporting, President Yoon has a goal that South Korea be the 4th largest exporter by 2027, and in increasingly agitated tensions on the peninsula, what do you think the United States can do to mediate a potential arms race on the Korean peninsula, or should we mediate at all?
Yeah, let me offer some thoughts on 2 of those questions. On the question of what does it mean for Iran if North Korea is recognized as a de facto nuclear weapon state? I would say, well, we have examples of this in the past, right? India and Pakistan, for example. India was recognized as a de facto nuclear weapon state. You had the Nuclear Suppliers Group give it clean chit for a US-India nuclear deal. Now, I'm not saying India and North Korea are in the same place. But what I am saying is that if you're Iran, you've got other examples to look at beyond North Korea. You've got India and Pakistan to look at. You've got Israel to look at as countries that can possess nuclear weapons, be recognized as doing so, and with that comes a certain amount of responsibility as well, right? So then the question, if you're North Korea wanting that status, is the question of, are you ready to act as a state that is deserving of that status, as a state that has that status, right? So I think it's really less of what we're facilitating for North Korea versus what it's kind of facilitating for itself through its actions as a possessor of nuclear weapons. So that's one. On the question of what the United States can do, if it should do anything at all in South Korea, I think the potential for South Korean nuclear development, nuclear weapons development, has been high for a while. And all these projections that you see of where is this world going to be in 2035 with regard to different things. And on the nuclear question, we're worried about Japan, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, and Iran as the 4 main countries that might potentially build nuclear weapons, right? So I think for the United States, the question is, how do you actually calibrate enough support to South Korea as the United States to say, hey, don't develop nuclear weapons. We're here. We have given you extended deterrence. We are not going to abandon you. Now, what is the perfect calibration? I don't know. But I do have a colleague who is working on that at the LSE, who's a student of Scott's called Lauren Sukin, who has some answers on that.
I'll just add on the South Korea dimension. My view is that, imagine a scenario where the U.S. bilateral alliance with South Korea is for some reason terminated. I think very quickly you would see South Korea move to build nuclear weapons at that point. So then the question is, what can the U.S. do, given the existing alliance, to reassure officials in Seoul that its commitment is robust? What some in South Korea would like would be something analogous to what NATO countries have. They want to be involved in what joint nuclear planning might look like in the event of war. They might even want the reintroduction of U.S. nuclear weapons on South Korean soil. U.S. nuclear weapons were in South Korea for several decades, but were pulled out in 1991 after the end of the Cold War. So there's been some discussion about that. I don't think you need to go that far in order to reassure South Korea, but that could be an option that's on the table. The broader point I would make is that the U.S. alliance architecture has been tremendously helpful for promoting non-proliferation. So one concern I have is if the U.S. alliance system begins to weaken, one major consequence of that will be we're going to see more and more countries thinking about getting their own nuclear weapons, and some of them will go on and do so, in my view. So, I think we should continue the trajectory we're on with South Korea. The Biden administration held meetings, relatively recently to try and reassure South Korea on the nuclear issue. And I think that those meetings were successful. And so I think we're on a good trajectory there. We just need to keep doing more of what we've been doing from the U.S. standpoint.
Yeah, I would note on South Korea, the United States has 35,000 troops in South Korea, and we should keep them there. Those men and women are sometimes called a tripwire, which I think is a bit derogatory, but it is true that they would be involved in any North Korean attack on South Korea. So the U.S. has skin in the game, and that's important to keep that. 2 other points. One, I actually don't think Iran is looking to see, will the United States eventually give some security or safety assistance to North Korea, and therefore it's safer for us. They're looking at, if we move forward with our nuclear weapons program, will Israel attack us? And what happened this week showed the Iranians that Israel has a military capability used in a very constrained way to penetrate Iran And it was a warning. And the fact that they hit a base in Isfahan was another way of saying, we could go after your nuclear program. Now, they don't want to do that because they know the program's in a lot of places. They know that the Iranians could rebuild it really quickly, and that would ensure that Iran would eventually get nuclear weapons. So they want to keep the current situation, but I think it was that deterrent, that was the message, that was the signal that was given by Israel. And then one last point to your very good question. I think the most serious false warning that I know about occurred just here, Cheyenne Mountain, in 1979, when a attack came up that had then Soviet submarine-launched ballistic missiles coming in first, ICBMs coming in half an hour later, and the officer involved did the right thing, which is to warn people at the Pentagon, we have this, but he noticed something. He said, you know, this looks exactly like what we've been trained, and this is a scenario exactly like to the T of what we've been trained. Maybe in a real war, it wouldn't be exactly like what we, and so in that way, having a man in the loop gave this counterintuitive safety because he recognized that real war wouldn't be like that. And he reported it that way and cast doubt about what he was seeing. And to me, that's yet one more reason why we always have to have a man in the loop. I don't think humans are perfect, but I think they can sometimes creatively recognize something that isn't happening, even though they've been trained to think that that's the way it's going to look. And I find that to be a fascinating case. And maybe one notion of hope is that human beings sometimes can do smart things, even when our machines fail us.
I love that. Oh, we are going to take a couple more questions, quick questions, and then give a final lightning round, all right? So I see you in the back, right in the middle. I'd love to go to you, and then, oh my goodness, how do we pick? Pat, I see that hand. I'm going to pick on you then, okay?
Where am I going?
Hi. Hi. Thanks for the discussion. I just have a comment and a question. Comment is that it seems to me that in the last 80 years since the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing, the countries which have developed nuclear capability, the deterrence works. We have seen it multiple ways. Iran and Israel just kind of backed down. India and China have fought hand-to-hand combat. India and Pakistan have fought combats, but they haven't used the nuclear weapons on each other. So deterrence works. I think Professor from Stanford said earlier that if Ukraine had nuclear war, perhaps they would not have been attacked. I could probably say the same thing. Saudi Arabia or Egypt might have nuclear weapons, then perhaps Gaza would not have been attacked with all the atrocities which have been happening there. So I think deterrence works. And then in order to get to that deterrence, negotiation works. Failed states like North Korea, Pakistan, and Iran actually are able to bring world powers like US to the negotiation table and get what they are looking for and buy time, perhaps in order to get to the nuclear program where they want to get to. So my question to the panel is that, what do you think of acquiring nuclear weapons, not as a deterrence, which obviously we know it works, but as a negotiation tactic, especially for Matt, who has talked about diplomacy, negotiation, and bargaining. So that's an overlooked factor, perhaps, for the countries which want to acquire nuclear weapon, but also bring other world powers to the negotiating table to get what they want. Thank you.
First off, I'd just like to say thank all of you guys for the speech. I'm incredibly lucky to be here. I'm only a sophomore at Columbine High School, so I deeply appreciate all of you guys providing this opportunity to me. one thing that I would just like to ask, and Professor from Stanford, you touched on it a little bit, is all of the conflict in the Middle East. The Middle East is obviously, and has been for a long time, a very complicated and hostile region. And one thing I'd just like to touch on are recent events with Israel, recent events with Iran. And frankly, there is a recent paper, or semi-recent paper, published by Debs and Montero from 2017, all the way back in 2017, that stated that Iranian nuclearization would trigger a proliferation cascade throughout the Middle East if none of those countries in the Middle East provide or had reliable U.S. security guarantees. Now we've seen the U.S.'s role in the Middle East become more diminished, more focused on the protection of Israel, but at the same time, that has also led to increased conflicts with Iran. And so we've seen how this paper has been disproven, that despite our reliable security guarantees with Israel, we're seeing increased hostility with Iran. So my question for all of for the chair is, what steps can the United States take moving forward to drastically reduce any proliferation that might happen in the future? And what can we do to reduce conflict now?
Thank you. You know, my question is just before UN in North Korea, before Putin invaded Ukraine, if I remember Professor Doss, it was really the rogue actor in Pakistan or the rogue actor anywhere. And I just want, where do you put the rogue actor in this right now, and the security of those nuclear warheads in countries that are so unstable? Yeah, thank you.
My final comment will be to the gentleman in the back who was talking about the optimism about mutual deterrence existing. I think that deterrence is a powerful force, but a very imperfect force for the reasons that we were just discussing. But I would also note that nuclear weapons are not just a deterrent. They are sometimes used as a shield behind which you can take aggressive action. So we now have Saddam's tapes. Saddam liked to tape his conversations. And when he was seeking to acquire nuclear weapons, he told his military that if we get nuclear weapons, Israel won't be able to retaliate, and we will invade Israel, and maybe there'll be 50,000, he talks about there'll be rivers of blood, and we may lose 50,000 troops or more, but we'll be able to conquer Israel. So the spread of nuclear weapons might have some deterrent effect, but it could also have some shielding effect for states that are aggressive and are revisionist. And therefore, I'm not someone who thinks that the spread of nuclear weapons will have that positive of an effect.
Thank you, Scott. Matt, final words from you.
Thanks. On the bargaining chip question, one thing I'd say is that there's a long history of U.S. allies dangling the possibility they might get nuclear weapons in order to extract stronger security guarantees from the United States. For example, Spain tried this strategy in the early 1970s as its nuclear program was advancing before it was a member of NATO. Spain didn't come in NATO until 1982. And so there is a history of countries using the prospect of getting nuclear weapons to try and extract stronger concessions. And to a certain degree, I think that's also what South Korea is doing today, even though I do believe that they're very serious about the security threats they're facing, and I'm concerned from a non-proliferation standpoint about what South Korea might do. On the question about nuclear dominoes falling and what the United States can do, it's a great question. There's a long history of worrying about proliferation cascades. If you go back to the 1960s, you can find declassified documents that the CIA was producing about what would happen if China got nuclear weapons. And there was widespread concerns that this would lead to wholesale nuclear proliferation in Asia. And that ended up not happening. India did get nuclear weapons eventually in response to China's 1964 nuclear test, but the degree of the dominoes falling wasn't as big as the CIA worried about. Now, why was that? The CIA was right in the sense that the Chinese nuclear test increased demand in a lot of other countries for nuclear weapons. But what the CIA missed or didn't fully appreciate would be all the things that the US would do to counteract that increased appetite for nuclear weapons. So, you know, think about the spread of nuclear weapons like the spread of a disease, where if you want to think about how a disease spreads, you need to account for the strength of the pathogen, the strength of the host, and the strength of the intervention. If we just sit back and we do nothing, there's going to be a lot more nuclear proliferation in the world. So just like certain interventions might limit the spread of diseases, similarly, interventions by the United States and others play a big role in limiting the spread of nuclear weapons. So if Iran does go on to build nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, others have said they're going to follow suit. The United States, to stave that off, will have to intervene, or other countries will have to intervene to try and prevent that from happening. History shows that they might be able to be successful, but they're going to have to take swift, serious action.
Thank you so much, Matt. Debak.
Yeah, and completely endorse what Matt just said. I think adding on to that, on the excellent question about what can the United States do, I think there are two things that it can do immediately in the Middle East. And it is doing some of that, at least on one front, which is, one, try to get back some form of the Iran deal, the JCPOA that the Trump administration backed out of. The Biden administration has been trying to get Iran to agree to another deal. There are valid concerns, I think, on the Iranian side as to why they should come back to the table. But I think that's really one of the most important things. Before we can get to a proliferation cascade, get Iran to sign a nuclear deal in some form. The second is, of course, reduce some of the insecurity that Iran is facing. And some of that has to do with also Israel and the US policy of helping Israel with military aid, allowing it to do things like strikes on, say, an Iranian embassy in Syria, right, which led to the latest missile attack. So is there a way that the US can calibrate Israeli action that threatens Iran and might push it towards a bomb? I think there is, and that's something that needs to be thought about. On the question of the rogue actor, I think that worry, at least if you're sitting in New Delhi, has never really gone away about, especially when Pakistan developed tactical nuclear weapons, short-range nuclear weapons in 2009. There was always a worry that, what if you get one battlefield commander who has control of the nuclear weapon, who thinks that they're about to be overrun and they're in this use it or lose it sort of situation. That worry hasn't necessarily gone away, but there is an understanding between India and Pakistan that by and large, Pakistan's nuclear weapons are in safe possession. And that worry's, in fact, gone down the ladder of worries that we have about Pakistan or China, or where potential nuclear use is far more likely today, which is Ukraine. So that's just gone to the back of our minds, if you will, but it's not disappeared.
Well, on that not so comforting note, I just want to thank you, Professors Sagan and Fuhrmann and Das, also to direct all of you who are interested in learning more to the remarkable writing that all three of these folks on the panel have published recently and for decades on this topic. And to thank you all again for being here tonight. I'm really delighted to be able to host events like this with such wonderful questions from so many of you in the crowd tonight. So again, thanks to World Denver, thanks to the Sié Center team that put on the event, and thanks to all of you for being here. Have a wonderful rest of your night.